The last few weeks have been game-changing for China. President Xi Jinping and the Chinese Communist Party have bowed to the citizens after weeks of protests. Faced with widespread backlash, China's zero-COVID policy is now being junked. We ask a simple question: is the Communist Party's hold over China crumbling? To answer that question, it helps to understand what sparked the protests in China and how we got here in the first place. When the COVID-19 pandemic began, Xi Jinping and the CCP enacted what was called a zero-COVID strategy. Now, this phrase, zero COVID, has been thrown around a lot. But what does it actually mean? Essentially, it calls for COVID-19 infections to be eliminated quickly and efficiently. China deployed a massive testing apparatus that could test millions of people in days. Once cases were identified, infected citizens were hauled off to quarantine along with anyone they had been in contact with. Infected neighborhoods were locked down for weeks on end to contain the spread of cases. Travel was banned and economic activity was disrupted. This strict strategy stood in contrast to many Western societies, where countries decided to manage rather than outright eliminate COVID-19. Now, zero COVID was successful for a while. As a number of Western countries, and most notably the United States, were brought to their knees by massive case numbers, China fared better. The country has officially recorded only 6,000 deaths among a population of 1.4 billion people. By comparison, the United States has recorded more than 1 million deaths in a population of only 330 million. While the Chinese government has always been known to fudge figures, it was clear that zero COVID had reduced China's case count and its fatalities. Xi Jinping and the CCP declared victory. The government in Beijing told anyone who would listen that zero COVID represented the victory of China's disciplined social system over the chaotic democracies of the West and India. That was where the problems began. You see, zero COVID was never a popular policy in China. Part of the reason was economic. When a COVID case was confirmed, an entire neighborhood would be swiftly shut down. These repeated shutdowns were especially hard for businesses, many of which had to close down for good. Goldman Sachs, a premier investment bank, estimates that the zero COVID strategy caused China's growth rate to drop by as much as 4 to 5% of GDP. That slowdown had a crushing economic cost for the country's millions of poor migrant laborers who traveled from rural China to seek jobs in factories and businesses that were closed because of the zero COVID strategy. The youth suffered as well, and unemployment among the young shot up to almost 20%. What made zero COVID even more unpopular was how it was enforced. Lockdowns were brutally and often heartlessly implemented. Chinese social media was filled with images of citizens being separated from families and manhandled by government officials. Citizens in lockdown areas were unable to receive regular supplies of food, medicine, and water. At one point, a bizarre video surfaced that showed Chinese health officials trying to kill a pet dog whose owner had been carted off to a quarantine facility. Thousands of small incidents like this went viral in China, and public anger reached a boiling point. The fingers began to point in one direction: Xi Jinping and the Chinese Communist Party. However, the government still claimed that the zero COVID policy would keep citizens safe. Unfortunately, that claim was no longer true. The highly infectious Omicron variant effectively broke the zero COVID strategy by spreading so fast that lockdowns couldn't contain it. Rather than shifting to a strategy that would involve mitigating the virus, Xi Jinping's government stubbornly refused to abandon the zero COVID strategy. For example, the government locked down 26 million people in Shanghai for close to 2 months with little access to medical care as thousands of cases began to pile up. The government refused to end zero COVID for a few key reasons. First, after talking about how superior China's strategy was to Western rivals, President Xi and the Chinese Communist Party could not admit that the strategy had failed. Second, unlike India, the government simply did not vaccinate enough people. For example, millions of China's senior citizens are still not properly vaccinated. According to some estimates, about 1/3 of those over 80 have not received 2 doses of the COVID-19 vaccine. Many more have not received a 3rd or a 4th booster shot. This also led to President Xi's third problem. China's vaccines aren't all that good. For example, the effectiveness of Indian jabs was 99.3% among fully vaccinated people. For China, that number could be as low as 60%. Of course, China could always import more effective vaccines from overseas, but that would mean a humiliating acceptance that the West's vaccines are better than China's. Essentially, the Chinese Communist Party is happy to let citizens suffer rather than admit that they got something wrong. The problem for them was that the Chinese citizens began to catch on. Public anger reached epic proportions and protests began to erupt. Workers in Apple's massive factory in Zhengzhou erupted in demonstrations after they were poorly treated in China's endless lockdowns. Protests also broke out across China in major cities like Shanghai, Beijing, Wuhan, and Nanjing. Citizens called for more freedoms, and some even called for the Chinese Communist Party and Xi Jinping to be removed from power. While the protests were contained, the writing was on the wall. President Xi finally accepted the inevitable and began loosening the zero-COVID system. Restrictions on movement were eased, and quarantine requirements were made less strict, among other moves. So, is the crisis over for Xi Jinping and the CCP? Not quite. The crisis over zero COVID may have significantly damaged the Chinese Communist Party's power, and there are a few reasons why. First, China's authoritarian system of government runs on a simple bargain. The citizens give up many rights and liberties that citizens in other countries enjoy, while the government agrees to deliver high rates of growth and a better future. For decades, China's people were happy to put up with the dictatorship in Beijing because their lives continued to improve. That deal is now dead. The zero-COVID strategy caused millions to lose their livelihoods and caused record levels of unemployment for China's youth, who are finding it difficult to secure the well-paying jobs that their parents had. China's era of high growth is over, and President Xi's disastrous zero-COVID strategy may have ensured that even modest growth levels will not be seen again in the near future. Without strong economic growth, citizen discontent will rise, and the Communist Party will have to pay the price. Worryingly for the Chinese Communists, the party's image has taken a beating. The zero-COVID strategy exposed the most brutal and repressive side of the regime. Because it failed to vaccinate senior citizens and prepare China's healthcare system, the Chinese government has also destroyed any reputation it once had for competence. The only problem is that is going to get a lot worse. Experts indicate that opening up the country now will lead to a wave of infections that could kill anywhere between 1.3 million to 2.1 million people. The resulting backlash will be directed solely at China's dictators. Most damagingly, China's Communist Party and President Xi have been forced into a humiliating retreat by angry citizens. For the first time in decades, protesting citizens have openly called for the removal of China's authoritarian rulers. One protester said, "We don't want lockdowns, we want freedom. We don't want lies, we want dignity. We don't want cultural revolution, we want reform. We don't want dictatorial leaders, we want elections. We don't want to be slaves, we want to be citizens." China's citizens have found their voice. That means a nightmare for the country's dictators may just have begun.